The sun didn't just set in 1885 Montana. It gave up. One moment, a weak December light filtered through the gray clouds. The next, it was gone, swallowed by a storm that promised to be the worst of the season. The wind was a physical thing, a monster that clawed across the rolling hills, carrying the first icy flakes of a 3-day howler. Breath turned to smoke, hope turned to desperation, and along a narrow, winding trail, a woman staggered forward. Her name was Lillian Reed. She was 28, but the pain etched into her face made her look a decade older. Every step was a fresh agony, her weight leaning heavily on a crutch she'd made from a broken broom handle. A purple and yellow bruise bloomed across her cheek. Her lip was split and barely healed. She was running from a monster, running from a memory, running for her life. "Mama, it's getting colder," a small voice said. 6-year-old Sarah clutched her mother's skirt, her little fingers red and raw. Her honey-brown hair peeked out from under a thin wool cap that was no match for a Montana winter. "Just a little further, love," Lillian whispered, the words stolen by the wind. She didn't know if she was telling the truth. All she had was a rumor, a whisper from a stable hand back in town about an old cabin somewhere on this trail. Beside them, 4-year-old Thomas said nothing. He just trudged on, his dark eyes wide and haunted. He hadn't said more than a dozen words in 3 weeks, not since the night they fled, the night Lillian Reed swung a fire iron, felt it connect with a sickening thud, and left a man she believed to be dead lying in a pool of his own blood. The woman stumbling through the blizzard didn't know if she was a widow or a murderer. Then the storm hit them full force. The wind roared down from the mountains like a freight train, bringing with it a blinding sheet of white. Visibility dropped to 0. Lillian pulled her children into her, a desperate, freezing huddle against the elements. She knew with a terrible, soul-crushing certainty that they would not survive the night out here. This was it. This was how they would be found. 3 frozen statues, a monument to a failed escape. But then a voice cut through the howl. "Mama, look!" It was Sarah. Through the swirling snow, a light. A tiny, warm flicker of gold in the distance. A window, a lantern, a cabin. Hope, which had been all but extinguished, flared back to life. Lillian steeled herself, ignoring the splintering protest of her crutch, and pushed forward. 100 yards, it might as well have been 100 miles. Her body screamed with every step, but the alternative was a cold, quiet death in the snow. She collapsed at the bottom of 3 wooden steps leading to a small porch. Her legs just gave out. The cabin stood sturdy against the storm, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. A barn stood nearby, the soft lowing of cattle promising life, warmth, and care. Sarah didn't hesitate. Her small fist pounded against the weathered wood. "Hello, please! Is anyone there?" The wind ate her words. No response. Sarah looked back at her mother, a crumpled heap in the snow. Something in the little girl's face hardened. She balled her fist and pounded again, louder, harder, with all the strength her 6-year-old body could muster. The door swung open. The man who stood there was a giant, tall enough that Sarah had to crane her neck to see his face. His hair touched his shoulders, but his dark beard was neatly trimmed. His eyes, in the warm lamplight, were the color of amber, and they were narrowed with suspicion. In his right hand, he held a shotgun. It was pointed at the ground, but it was ready. "What business have you here?" His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. Sarah swallowed, but she didn't back down. She stood her ground, a tiny warrior against the storm. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and formal. "If we clean your cabin, would you let Mama sleep here? She's too bruised to walk." The man's amber gaze shifted past the girl to Lillian, half conscious in the snow, with little Thomas kneeling beside her. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A flicker of something that wasn't suspicion. "Where's your father?" he asked, his voice a little softer but still wary. "Gone," Sarah answered simply. The man stood motionless for a long moment, a silhouette against the warmth of the cabin. The wind howled. Snow gathered on Sarah's eyelashes. Finally, he lowered the shotgun. "Get her inside," he said gruffly. He stepped onto the porch, and with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size, lifted Lillian from the snow. She flinched at his touch, her eyes flying open in alarm before pain and cold dragged her back under. Thomas shrank away, but Sarah grabbed his hand and pulled him forward, following the stranger into the warmth. The cabin was larger than it looked, clean and orderly. Not what you'd expect from a man living alone. Books lined shelves along one wall, dozens of them, all well-worn and carefully arranged. He laid Lillian on a narrow bed near the stone fireplace. "She needs warming," he muttered, more to himself than to the children. He stoked the fire until it roared, then hung a kettle over the flames. He hadn't asked them to leave. He hadn't asked for anything. He had simply brought them in from the storm that would have killed them. But Lillian knew better than to trust a stranger's kindness. Kindness always had a price, and she and her children had nothing left to pay with. "My name is Sarah Reed," the little girl announced, standing straight and tall. "This is my brother Thomas, and our mother is Lillian Reed. We are pleased to meet you, sir." The man looked at her, a hint of surprise in his amber eyes. "Ethan Porter," he replied after a moment. "This is my property." "We'll clean very well to pay for staying, Mr. Porter," Sarah said solemnly. "I can sweep and dust. Thomas is good at stacking wood." The boy, still hiding behind his sister, nodded silently. Ethan ignored the offer. His attention was on Lillian, who was starting to stir. He frowned at the ugly bruises on her face, at the way her ankle was bent at an unnatural angle. When her eyes fluttered open, he took a step back, giving her space. "Where?" Lillian started, trying to sit up before a gasp of pain stopped her. "Don't move," Ethan said. "Your ankle's likely broken, and you've nearly frozen besides." "Mama, we found a cabin!" Sarah rushed to her side. "This is Mr. Porter. I told him we'd clean if he let us stay." Lillian's gaze shot to Ethan, fear flashing in her eyes. It was a look he recognized, the look of a hunted animal that senses a predator. "You and your children can shelter here until the storm passes," he said, keeping his voice even, his posture non-threatening. "Nothing is required in return." The kettle whistled. He turned away to make tea, giving her a moment. When he came back with a steaming mug, he didn't hand it to her directly. He placed it on a small table beside the bed. "Willow bark," he explained. "Helps with the pain." Lillian hesitated, then reached for the mug. "Thank you, Mr. Porter. We won't impose long." "Just until the storm passes," Ethan finished for her. "That'll be 3 days at least." He went to a trunk in the corner and pulled out a thick wool blanket, handing it to Sarah. "For your mother. There's stew warming. You children should eat." As Sarah tucked the blanket around her mother, Lillian finally got a good look at their host. He was maybe in his mid-30s, with the weathered face of a man who spent his life outdoors. But his eyes were what held her. They were watchful, weary, carrying a sadness that felt strangely familiar. "Mr. Porter," she asked, her voice a little steadier, "are we far from Willow Creek?" "5 miles," he answered. "Might as well be 50 in this storm." Lillian nodded, a little of the tension leaving her shoulders. They were hidden, for now. While the children ate ravenously, Ethan gathered medical supplies. He moved with a practiced efficiency, his movements slow and deliberate as he approached Lillian's bed. He always stayed where she could see him. "Your ankle needs tending," he said. It wasn't a question. "And that crutch of yours is more splinter than support. May I?" Lillian swallowed, her fear warring with necessity. Necessity won. She nodded. He worked with a surprising gentleness, his touch clinical and impersonal as he examined the swollen, discolored joint. "Sprained badly," he announced. "Not broken. You've been walking on this for some time." 3 weeks, Lillian answered. His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. He wrapped the ankle firmly with a clean bandage, then sat back on his heels. "The bruises," he said quietly, nodding toward her face. "Those weren't from a fall." It wasn't a question. Lillian's gaze dropped to her hands, twisting in her lap. No. Ethan nodded once. He didn't ask for more. He rose and returned to the kitchen, giving her a moment of privacy. Second door leads to a small room, he said, his back to her. Your children can sleep there. You take this bed. It's closest to the fire. And you, Mr. Porter? Lillian asked. I'll manage, he replied simply. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a fragile truce settled over the three strangers. Lillian watched Ethan as he moved about the cabin. He was a man of contradictions. Rough on the outside, but his hands were gentle. He was a recluse, but his cabin was filled with classic literature. He carried a shotgun, but he spoke softly to her children. She had run from a man she knew all too well, a man whose moods were as predictable as they were violent. Now she was trapped with a man she didn't know at all. And that, she thought, might be even more terrifying. The storm didn't let up. For 3 days, the world outside was a howling white void. Inside the cabin, a strange routine formed. Ethan would rise before dawn, tend to his animals, and return with fresh milk and eggs. Sarah, true to her word, would try to pay for their stay by sweeping with a broom twice her size, until Ethan gently took it from her hands and told her to sit by the fire. But we have to pay, she would insist, her small face serious. That's how it works. Your mother needs rest, and you need warmth, Ethan would reply, his voice soft. That's all that matters now. Lillian watched these exchanges from her bed, a strange tightness in her throat. Her children, who had learned to be silent and invisible to avoid their father's rage, were slowly uncurling in the quiet warmth of this stranger's home. Thomas, though still silent, would sit and watch Ethan carve small figures from scraps of wood. Sarah, starved for knowledge, discovered the bookshelf and was soon lost in worlds of adventure and poetry. Ethan fashioned a new crutch for Lillian, a sturdy piece of oak, padded and wrapped with leather. The craftsmanship was beautiful, the work of a man who took pride in what he made. This must have taken hours, Lillian said, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. Time is plentiful, Ethan shrugged. There was a debt forming between them, one of kindness and sanctuary, and Lillian had no idea how she could ever repay it. There is no debt, he said, as if reading her mind. His tone was firm, final. During the long afternoons, as the wind whistled and moaned around the eaves, a quiet companionship settled between the two adults. They would sit at the table, drinking coffee, the children reading by the fire. Lillian learned that Ethan was from the East, like her. She could tell by his accent, though he never offered any details about his past. He learned that she had been a teacher in Boston before she married. A teacher, he'd said, a flicker of surprise in his amber eyes. It seemed to please him. But there were things that remained unsaid. He never spoke of a wife or family. He never explained the books, or his medical knowledge, or the locked door to the second bedroom, which Sarah had discovered was bolted from the outside. He was a man of secrets. But then, so was she. On the evening of the second day, after the children were asleep, Lillian found the courage to speak. Mr. Porter, she began, her voice barely a whisper, I feel I owe you an explanation. You owe me nothing, Lillian, he said, using her first name for the first time. Least of all your story. But the words came spilling out anyway, a torrent of fear and guilt that she had held inside for 3 agonizing weeks. I thought I killed him, she whispered, the confession hanging in the quiet air between them. My husband. I struck him with a fire iron. He came for Sarah. There was so much blood. I was certain he was dead. She waited for the judgment, the disgust. She expected him to throw her out into the storm. Instead, Ethan's gaze remained steady, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Did he deserve it? He asked simply. Yes, she answered without hesitation. Ethan nodded once. Then you defended your child. There is no shame in that. 6 words, and with those 6 simple words, the mountain of guilt she had been carrying seemed to shrink. A stranger had given her an absolution she never thought she'd receive. A sob caught in her throat, quickly stifled. "Come inside," he said gently from the porch where they stood. "The cold will undo all your healing." As she settled back onto the bed by the fire, she watched him bank the flames for the night. "You were more than a rancher once," she observed quietly. He paused. "We all have previous lives, Lillian." He turned to his own sleeping place, a simple bedroll near the door. But as he did, Lillian noticed something she hadn't before. Tucked under his bedroll was a worn leather gun belt, the holster holding a Colt revolver. It was the weapon of a lawman, this quiet, gentle man who quoted poetry and cared for her children. He was no simple rancher. He was something else entirely, something dangerous, and she was beginning to wonder if she had escaped one kind of danger, only to find herself trapped in another. The storm broke on the third morning, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a blinding blanket of white. Lillian woke to an unfamiliar sound, her son's voice. "Outside," Thomas said softly, pointing a small finger at the window. It was the first word he'd spoken unprompted in weeks. Lillian hurried to the window. In the snow-covered clearing, Ethan was showing Sarah how to identify animal tracks. The big man and the little girl, their heads bent together in concentration. "He's not like Papa," Thomas whispered, his voice still fragile. "He doesn't shout. His hands are gentle." The simple observation was a knife to Lillian's heart. Later that morning, as Lillian was attempting to make biscuits, an unfamiliar sound drifted through the pines, the jingle of harness bells. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, his relaxed posture gone, replaced by a tense vigilance. He grabbed the shotgun from above the mantel. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. Sarah's eyes went wide. "Is it Papa?" "No, sweetheart," Lillian said, her own heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Through the window, they watched Ethan approach a horse-drawn sleigh. The driver was an old man with a beard as white as the snow around them. After a brief conversation, Ethan beckoned for Lillian to come outside. "Lillian, this is Doc Sullivan," Ethan said. "He makes rounds after storms." The doctor tipped his hat, his keen eyes taking in the fading bruises on Lillian's face without comment. "Ethan's good with injuries," the old man said, a strange emphasis on his words. "Military training serves well in these parts." Military. Another piece of the puzzle that was Ethan Porter clicked into place. While the doctor examined Lillian's ankle, pronouncing it well tended, Ethan drew her aside. "Doc brings news from town," he said, his voice grim. "A man has been asking questions, a woman and 2 children. Dark-haired woman, a girl about 6, a boy about 4. The blood drained from Lillian's face. "Victor." The name was a choked whisper. "He's alive," Ethan nodded. "And he's looking for you." The world tilted. The brief sanctuary she'd found was gone, shattered. "I have to leave," she said, panic clawing at her throat. "I won't bring this danger to your home." "Listen to me." Ethan's hands were on her arms, his grip steady, forcing her to meet his gaze. "The passes east are blocked. The only way out is through town, and that's the first place he'll look. You'd freeze before you made 10 miles. "What choice do I have?" she cried, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "He'll kill me this time." "Stay," Ethan said. The single word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "I can't ask that of you," she whispered. "You don't know him." "I know men like him," Ethan interrupted, something dark and knowing in his eyes. "He won't find you here. This cabin isn't on any maps." "Why?" Lillian asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you risk this for us?" Ethan's expression was unreadable. Some things don't require knowing, only doing. But before she could press him, Doc Sullivan returned from his sleigh, his face grave. "There's more, Ethan. He's not alone. He's got 2 men with him, rough-looking characters." 3 men, an armed posse. Lillian felt a fresh wave of despair wash over her. As the doctor prepared to leave, he pulled Ethan aside. Lillian couldn't hear their hushed conversation, but she saw Ethan's jaw tighten, his posture stiffen. After Doc's sleigh disappeared, Ethan stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the snow. When he finally came inside, his face was a mask. "What is it?" Lillian asked. "What did he tell you?" Ethan hesitated. "Your husband. He isn't just asking questions. He's been meeting with Judge Crawford, the local magistrate." Lillian frowned, not understanding the significance. "Lillian," Ethan said, and his voice was heavy. "The bruises on your face, the fear in your eyes. I've seen it before. My wife had that same look." He walked to the locked bedroom door, pulling a key from his pocket. "I think it's time you knew who I really am." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, the room was preserved like a shrine. A woman's shawl was draped over a chair. A silver-backed brush sat on a small vanity. On the bedside table was a wedding portrait. A beautiful woman with kind eyes stood beside a younger, clean-shaven Ethan. He was wearing the uniform of a United States Marshal. "My wife, Rebecca," Ethan said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. "She was murdered 3 years ago." Lillian's hand flew to her mouth. "I'm so sorry." "I was sheriff of Riverside County," he continued, his gaze fixed on the portrait. "Rebecca discovered that Judge Crawford was running a trafficking ring, using the railroads to transport women and children east. She was killed before she could bring me the evidence." The pieces crashed together in Lillian's mind with sickening force. Victor's sudden desperation for money, his talk of taking Sarah to visit family in Chicago, his unholy rage when she refused. "Oh, God," she whispered, leaning against the doorframe for support. "That's why. That's what he wanted Sarah for. It wasn't just a beating. It wasn't just abuse. He had been planning to sell his own daughter." "You stopped him," Ethan said, his voice a low anchor in her spinning world. "You protected her." Lillian looked at Ethan, at this man who had lost everything to the same evil that had almost consumed her own child. His reclusiveness, his sadness. It wasn't just grief. It was a self-imposed exile. A hunt. "You've been investigating him all this time," she realized. "And now," Ethan said, turning to face her, his amber eyes burning with a cold fire, "you've brought me my first living witness." The fragile hope she had felt was replaced by a new, more terrifying reality. They weren't just hiding from an abusive husband. They were key witnesses in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of local power. And the men hunting them wouldn't stop until they were silenced. Permanently. "I won't let him take them," Lillian vowed, her voice shaking, but filled with a new, hard resolve. "I'll die first." "It won't come to that," Ethan promised. And for the first time, she saw the lawman, the marshal, looking out from behind the grieving husband's eyes. "Because you're not alone anymore." The sanctuary had become a stronghold. The recluse had become an ally, and the hunted had decided to fight back. They had 2 days. 2 days until the trails were clear enough for a full-scale search party to ride out. 2 days to prepare for a war they couldn't afford to lose. The plan was desperate, risky, but it was the only one they had. They would make a run for Helena, to the federal marshal's office, bypassing the corrupt local authorities entirely. Ethan had a portfolio of evidence, 3 years of painstaking work, that combined with Lillian's testimony could bring the entire trafficking ring down. But Helena was 3 days away, 3 days on horseback, with 2 small children, in the dead of winter, hunted by ruthless men who had the law on their side. Ethan decided he needed more information. Against Lillian's protests, he rode into Willow Creek. "I've been a stranger here for 3 years," he assured her. "No one will connect me to you." Before he left, he taught her how to use the shotgun. Her hands were steady, her eyes clear. The terrified woman who had collapsed at his door was gone, replaced by a soldier defending her young. In town, Ethan learned how dire their situation truly was. At the general store, he came face to face with Victor Reed himself. Victor was charming, handsome, spinning a tale of a mentally unstable wife who had attacked him in a fit of madness. He was offering a $20 reward for information. The whole town was on his side. Then, at the saloon, Ethan learned something that made his blood run cold. Victor and his men had been asking about abandoned cabins in the high country. They were talking to a trapper named Jimmy Dale, a man who knew the location of Ethan's cabin. Time was running out. He sent a telegraph to a former colleague, a U.S. Marshal in Helena, requesting information on Victor Reed. It was a risk, but one he had to take. As he left the telegraph office, he saw Victor on the hotel porch, deep in conversation with Judge Crawford. The judge handed Victor a piece of paper. They shook hands like business partners. Ethan rode back to the cabin with a grim certainty. The hunt was coming. Sooner than they thought. He was right. The next afternoon, Doc Sullivan appeared, his horse lathered from a hard ride. "They're coming, Ethan," he said, breathless. "Crawford issued a warrant for your arrest, Lillian. Attempted murder and kidnapping. He's deputized Reed's men and is forming a search party." The law was now officially on the side of the monsters. Doc handed Ethan a telegram that had just arrived. It was the reply from Helena. Victor Reed was a known associate of the trafficking ring. He owed them a massive gambling debt. He was paying it off with merchandise. There was no more time. They had to run. Tonight. "I can create a distraction," Doc offered. "A false alarm at the Thornton Ranch. It'll keep them busy in town for a few hours." The plan was set. They would leave at nightfall, taking the treacherous North Trail to Helena. Doc would meet them at midnight at Baker's Ridge, an old mining camp, with fresh horses and supplies. As twilight fell, Ethan went into Rebecca's room one last time. He gathered his portfolio of evidence, the culmination of his 3-year quest for justice. He looked at her portrait. "I'm close," he whispered. "I'm going to make it right." When he came out, Lillian was bundling the children in warm coats. Their eyes met. A silent understanding passed between them. They were in this together until the end. They rode out under the cover of a new moon, the horses' hooves muffled by the snow. Sarah rode in front of Ethan, Thomas with Lillian. They moved like ghosts through the forest, the silence broken only by the creak of leather and the soft sigh of the wind. An hour into their journey they heard it. The distant sound of men's voices carried on the cold night air. Tracks heading north! Fresh! They'd been found. Ethan spurred his horse, Lillian close behind. Stealth gave way to a desperate, frantic speed. They crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces. Behind them, shouts grew louder. A rifle shot cracked through the night, splintering the bark of a tree inches from Ethan's head. They broke from the forest onto a moonlit slope. Baker's Ridge was just ahead. But so were their pursuers. Ethan saw 3 riders emerge from the trees, fanning out, closing in. Another shot rang out. Ethan veered toward a jumble of boulders, their only hope for cover. "Follow me!" he yelled to Lillian. They scrambled behind the rocks just as gunfire erupted around them. Ethan pulled his rifle free, pushing the children behind the largest boulder. Lillian drew the revolver Doc had given her, her face pale but determined. "We'll hold them off together," she said. "Porter!" Victor Reed's voice echoed across the snow. "So you're the one harboring my wife! A mistake you'll regret!" "I know what you are, Reed," Ethan shouted back. "I know what you planned for Sarah." "The ravings of a hysterical woman," Reed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Hand them over, and I might let you live." Ethan's response was a warning shot that kicked up snow at Reed's feet. The firefight began in earnest. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, screaming through the cold air. One of Reed's men went down, clutching his shoulder. A bullet grazed Ethan's arm, a hot, searing pain. Reed was closing in, moving from rock to rock with deadly precision. "You belong to me, Lillian," he snarled. "The children belong to me. It's the law." "You're a monster, Victor!" she screamed back. "I'll die before I let you near them again." "That can be arranged." Suddenly, in the chaos, Ethan saw a flash of movement. Sarah. Terrified, she had broken cover, making a run for the trees. Reed was faster. He lunged, grabbing the little girl, pulling her in front of him as a shield. He pressed the barrel of his pistol to her small head. "Drop your weapons!" he roared, his voice triumphant. "Or she dies right now." Time stopped. The world narrowed to the sight of that gun against Sarah's temple. "Please, Victor," Lillian sobbed, her strength finally breaking. "She's your daughter." "She's merchandise," Reed sneered. "Worth more sold than kept. Now drop the guns." Ethan knew, with absolute certainty, that Reed would kill them all no matter what they did. He was a witness, a threat. As if reading his mind, Reed's cruel smile widened. "After you're disarmed, your protector dies first, then the boy. And you, my dear Lillian, you'll have a tragic accident on the way back to town." Sarah whimpered, tears streaming down her face. The sight ignited a cold, primal fury in Ethan. He locked eyes with Lillian across the moonlit snow. No words were needed. In that single, desperate glance, a plan was forged. Ethan slowly, deliberately, began to lower his rifle. "All right, Reed," he said, his voice steady. "You win." "On the ground," Reed commanded. "Both of you." Ethan bent down, as if to place his rifle in the snow, but in one fluid motion, he dropped to one knee. His movement revealed what had been hidden behind him. Little Thomas, standing behind a rock, his small 4-year-old hands holding Lillian's heavy revolver. His eyes were wide with terror, but his aim, steadied by the stone, was true. He had been silent for weeks, a ghost in the background, but he had been watching, learning. The shot that shattered the night didn't come from Ethan's rifle or Reed's pistol. It came from the small boy. The bullet struck Victor Reed in his gun arm. He howled in pain and shock, his grip on Sarah loosening for just a second. It was all the time Ethan needed. He lunged forward, scooping Sarah into his arms as he brought his rifle back up. Lillian rushed to Thomas, who stood frozen, the heavy revolver dropping from his numb fingers. Enraged, Reed raised his pistol with his uninjured hand. "You taught my own son to shoot me," he screamed, his face a mask of disbelief and hate. Before he could fire, Ethan's rifle cracked once more. Victor Reed fell backward into the snow, a look of permanent surprise on his face. A dark stain spread across the pristine white. Silence. The only sound was Sarah's frantic sobs and the approaching jingle of sleigh bells as Doc Sullivan finally arrived. The old doctor stared at the scene, the wounded men, the body in the snow, the family huddled together behind the rocks. "My God," he murmured. "Are you all right?" Ethan looked at Lillian, kneeling in the snow, clutching her children. Her face was pale, but her eyes were filled with a fierce, burning light. "We survived," Ethan answered. "For now, that's enough." But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had won the battle, but the war against Judge Crawford and his network was just beginning. Their journey to Helena was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Ethan's wounds, and Lillian's, were hastily bandaged by Doc. They left Reed's wounded men tied up for the authorities Doc would anonymously alert, and took their prisoner, Deputy Taylor, with them. They traveled through the night, pushing themselves and the horses to the limit. They knew Crawford would not give up easily. He would have men covering every trail. And he did. The next night, as they navigated a treacherous ravine, they were ambushed. Not by Victor's hired thugs, but by more of Crawford's men, lawmen turned killers. A rifle shot in the dark took out Lillian's horse. It went down, screaming, and she was thrown into the snow. In a desperate move, Ethan hauled her onto his own horse, now carrying all 4 of them. They were trapped. "You have to go," Lillian said, her voice urgent in his ear. "They're tracking 1 horse. I'll lead them away. Get the children to safety, Ethan." Before he could argue, she slid off the horse, taking a revolver he pressed into her hand. She gave her children one last fierce look. "Be brave," she whispered, and then she limped off into the darkness, a lone decoy against a pack of wolves. Ethan spurred the horse onward, his heart a block of ice in his chest. But Crawford's men were smart. They split up. 2 came after Ethan and the children, 1 went after Lillian. Ethan was forced to make another impossible choice. He hid the children in a dense stand of pines. "Don't come out no matter what you hear," he ordered them. Then he turned to face the 2 men alone. The firefight was brutal. Ethan was a good shot, but he was outnumbered. He took a bullet in the shoulder, then another in his thigh. He was bleeding badly, his strength failing. He managed to take down one man, Deputy Taylor, knocking him unconscious, but the second had him cornered. "Crawford sends his regards," the man sneered, aiming his rifle at Ethan's chest. Ethan closed his eyes, thinking of the children hidden in the trees, of Lillian alone in the wilderness. He had failed. A shot rang out, but it wasn't the one he was expecting. The man in front of him crumpled to the ground. Through the trees, Doc Sullivan appeared, a smoking rifle in his hands. "Damn fool," the doctor muttered, hurrying to Ethan's side. "Thought you could use some help." He had followed the sounds of the gunfight. They found the children, safe but terrified. They loaded the unconscious deputy onto the sleigh. But their relief was short-lived. Lillian was still out there, being hunted. They followed her tracks through the ravine as dawn broke. The trail told a story of a desperate, running fight. They found signs of a struggle, blood in the snow. Then, they found the body of the man who had been chasing her. His head had been crushed with a large rock. Nearby lay the revolver Ethan had given her, empty. She had fought back. She had won. But she was gone. A faint trail led north toward Miners Pass, their original rendezvous point. "She's still following the plan," Doc said, a note of awe in his voice. They found her an hour later, a small, solitary figure stumbling through the snow, exhausted, bleeding from a head wound, but alive. When she saw them, her strength finally gave out, and she collapsed. Ethan, ignoring the fire in his own leg, rushed to her side, catching her before she hit the ground. "You're safe," he whispered, holding her. "Everyone's safe." The rest of the journey was a painful haze. They finally reached Helena, a strange, battered procession. 2 wounded adults, 2 traumatized children, an unconscious prisoner, and an old country doctor. They walked straight into the office of U.S. Marshal James Hargrove, an old friend of Ethan's. "Crawford," Ethan said, dropping his blood-stained portfolio of evidence on the marshal's desk. "It's all there. Trafficking, murder, 3 years of it." Hargrove took one look at the evidence, at Lillian's bruised face, at the children huddled behind her, and his own face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "Justice," he said, his voice like gravel. "Justice happens now." Arrests were made that night. Judge Crawford and his entire network were rounded up. The trafficking ring was broken. In a quiet hotel room in Helena, under federal protection, the healing began. The children slept in an adjoining room, finally safe. Lillian and Ethan sat by the fire, their wounds bandaged, their bodies aching, their souls bruised but not broken. "What will you do now?" Lillian asked softly. "Go back to your cabin?" Ethan looked at her, at this woman of impossible strength who had fought like a lioness for her children. He looked at the fire and thought of his cold, empty cabin, a shrine to a memory. "No," he said. "I don't think I can go back to that solitude." "Not after." He trailed off. "Not after what?" Lillian prompted gently. "After remembering what it feels like to protect something more than a memory," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "After meeting you." He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking for forever, Lillian. Not yet. It's too soon. But I am asking for a chance. Time to heal, to see if what we've found in all this darkness can grow into something real." Tears streamed down Lillian's face, but for the first time in a very long time, they were not tears of fear or pain. They were tears of hope. "The children adore you," she whispered, "and I think I could learn to as well." Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in a fresh, clean layer of white. It was a new beginning, for all of them. The road ahead was long, but they would walk it together. If you were moved by Lillian and Ethan's fight for survival, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think the future holds for this unlikely family.